In the middle of a billion-dollar crisis, a 12-year-old black girl walks into the boardroom. No title, no warning, just a calm voice that silences powerful men. What she says next doesn't just change the deal, it changes lives. One moment, one truth, and every eye in the room turns. Would you have listened to her? If this story stirs something in you, tap like, subscribe, and tell us where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it, where you are. Nathaniel Carter wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice, but this morning you could hear the tension in the room without a single word spoken. The top floor of the Carter building buzzed with the kind of tight-lipped urgency that only came before something either brilliant or catastrophic. It was 7:42 in the morning, and the final presentation with the French investors was scheduled to begin at 9 sharp. Not 10 minutes later, not a few more moments, these men didn't wait. They were punctual, calculated, and merciless with their time. Nathaniel knew that. He respected it. He built his reputation in rooms like that. What he didn't plan for, however, was a call from the hospital at 7:48. The company's only certified French-English interpreter had collapsed during breakfast. Severe food poisoning, according to the ER nurse. "There's no way she can make it," she said flatly. "She's barely conscious." Nathaniel hung up the call without saying thank you. He stood still for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian, his senior executive assistant, who was already typing frantically on her tablet. Vivian always had a backup plan. She didn't believe in fate. She believed in preparation. But even she couldn't conjure up a qualified French interpreter at the last minute during morning rush hour in the middle of the city. "I've called 3 agencies already," she said without being prompted. "All their people are booked or outside the city. I'm checking with the consulate now." Nathaniel nodded once but said nothing. The silence stretched. The pressure was almost physical. The French investors Jean-Luc Moreau and Adrien Belland were not ordinary venture capitalists. They represented a legacy fund that had turned obscure biotech startups into world-changing names. If Carter Bioworks secured their support, the next phase of their AI diagnostic platform could move into full-scale deployment. If they walked away, everything stalled. For months, maybe years. And all because of one voice that couldn't be there. Vivian kept talking. "We can postpone, we can't." Nathaniel interrupted finally. His tone was calm, but his jaw was tight. "Postponing looks like a lack of preparation. We've already delayed once. Another stall and they'll pull the offer. You know that." Vivian did know. She'd been with Nathaniel since his early days, pitching to empty hotel ballrooms. She had seen him win in rooms where he wasn't supposed to be heard. She trusted him. But even trust didn't fix this. "Maybe I can manage a soft translation," she offered. "Enough to bridge through. They both speak some English." "Right." Nathaniel looked at her, then at the folder she was holding. Inside were detailed technical documents on neural learning models, predictive diagnostics, data integrity protocols, all of it worded in the kind of scientific English that made even native speakers squint. Trying to soft translate that under pressure was like trying to land a plane with a manual written in another language. "It's not about language," Nathaniel said quietly. "It's about trust. If they don't feel we respect their culture, their language, their time, they won't trust the product no matter how good it is." Vivian didn't argue. She just looked away, frustrated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet. For a few long seconds, there was nothing but the buzz of the fluorescent lights, the murmur of staff behind the frosted glass, and the growing weight of a situation tipping out of control. Then softly, from somewhere on the floor below, came a voice. A girl's voice, young and clear, singing in French. It wasn't loud or showy. It floated upward like something uninvited, but oddly timely, cutting through the static of urgency like a ripple in still water. Neither Nathaniel nor Vivian moved at first. They weren't even sure they'd heard it correctly. Then it came again, familiar lyrics, perfect pronunciation, unmistakable melody. It was La Vie en Rose. Vivian blinked. "That's French, right?" Nathaniel didn't answer. He was already walking toward the service stairwell. Vivian followed without a word. They traced the sound down 2 flights to the back corridor of the maintenance level, an area lined with gray carts, mop buckets, and shelves of cleaning supplies. It was quiet here. No rush, no suits. Just a girl sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a janitor's supply closet, flipping through a worn paperback book with faded French lettering. She had earbuds in one hanging loose, the other still in place. She was singing along, soft but accurate, her voice steady, her accent flawless. She looked up when she noticed them. No fear, just curiosity. Vivian spoke first. "Hi, do you speak French?" The girl stood up. She was around 12, maybe 13. She had a calmness about her that didn't match the chaos upstairs. Her skin was a rich brown, her braids tied back in a tidy ponytail. Her name tag said Amira James. Beneath that in pen, visitor maintenance access approved. She nodded. Oui, je parle français. Pourquoi? Her voice was polite, confident. Vivian blinked again. You're fluent. Amira smiled slightly. My mom was from Lyon. She taught me every night after dinner. We didn't have cable. Nathaniel stepped closer. Where's your mother now? Amira hesitated for just a moment. She passed away last year. Cancer. Vivian softened. I'm sorry. It's okay, Amira said. She made me promise I'd never forget her language. Nathaniel looked at her more carefully now. This wasn't a novelty. This wasn't a parlor trick. The girl's eyes were focused, her posture straight, her voice steady. She wasn't just repeating lyrics. She knew the language. You're here with someone, he asked. My dad, she said, pointing toward the far hallway. Christopher James. He works facilities. Sometimes I come with him when I'm off school. I like the quiet and the books. Vivian looked down at the paperback in her hand, Les Miserables, English and French side-by-side translation. It was underlined and marked with sticky notes. You read this? I've been trying, Amira said. Some of it's hard, but I look up what I don't know. Nathaniel exchanged a look with Vivian. The question neither of them wanted to ask was now sitting in the air between them. Vivian cleared her throat. Amira, how comfortable are you translating from French to English? And the other way, Amira tilted her head. What kind of translation? Technical, Vivian said. Business, medical, words like data structure, diagnostic algorithm. Amira nodded slowly. I'd have to see the exact words, but if you show me what it means, I can probably find the right way to say it. My mom always said you can't just swap words, you have to understand the point. Nathaniel didn't smile, but something in his shoulders relaxed. It was subtle, but real. He turned to Vivian. Get her the material. Seriously, Vivian asked. Nathaniel, she's the only fluent French speaker in the building right now, he said. And we're out of time. He turned back to Amira. We'll give you something to read. If you don't understand it, no problem. But if you do, you might be able to help more people than you think. Amira didn't hesitate. If it helps someone else not lose their mom, I'll try. That was the first moment the tide shifted, not with trumpets, not with fanfare. Just a 12-year-old girl in sneakers and a school cardigan holding a battered copy of Les Miserables, offering to step into a room full of men in suits and translate words that could move millions, not dollars, but lives. Upstairs, the air was still tight with pressure, but downstairs, in that quiet corner of the building, no one ever noticed a thread had begun to pull. And for the first time that morning, Nathaniel Carter wasn't just worried about what could go wrong. He was wondering cautiously, reluctantly, but genuinely, what might go right. Nathaniel stood quietly beside the glass wall of the small conference room on the 12th floor, arms crossed, jaw set, watching through the clear panels as Amira flipped through the printed documents on the table in front of her. The city skyline stretched out behind her in pale morning light, but her attention never left the pages. Vivian sat opposite, a pen in hand, her expression unreadable but focused. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but tight like air just before a storm. Nothing dramatic was happening, and yet every second carried weight. Amira, only 12, didn't fidget or squirm. Her hands were still. Her eyes moved steadily across each line. Occasionally she paused, tilted her head, then continued reading. She hadn't asked for help or clarification once. The fluorescent lights above cast soft shadows on her face, catching the curve of her cheek as she leaned forward slightly, whispering a few words to herself under her breath in French. Her voice was quiet but sure. Nathaniel shifted his weight, watching closely. He was trained to read people, investors, engineers, board members, politicians. It was part of what made him an effective leader, but he had never tried to read a 12-year-old girl preparing to possibly save his entire company. There was something almost unsettling in how calm she looked. Not because she didn't understand the pressure he suspected she did, but because she was treating it with a kind of reverence, as if she knew that understanding these words meant something more than getting through a meeting. Vivian finally spoke. All right, Amira, I'm going to ask you to translate the first paragraph into French. Take your time. Amira looked up, nodded once, then began. Her French was fluid, her tone steady, pronunciation clean. She didn't speak like someone who memorized vocabulary lists she translated the sentence for, meaning not just word for word. After a few lines, she stopped. Some of this is technical, she said, glancing at the second page, but it's not hard if you know what it's for. The AI is trained to recognize biomarkers in scans, right? You want to detect disease early, especially in parts of the world without a lot of doctors. Vivian blinked, then nodded slowly. Yes, that's right. Amira pointed to a line. You can say Système d'apprentissage automatique pour l'analyse diagnostique précoce here, but it would help if you explain that the goal is to support, not replace doctors. Otherwise, people might think you're trying to get rid of them, especially in France. They care a lot about medical autonomy. Nathaniel stepped forward. How do you know that Amira didn't look up right away? She finished reading the sentence, then replied without a hint of hesitation. My mom used to talk about it. She said people in France trust their doctors more than computers. But if you tell them the machine helps doctors, not replaces them, they listen better. Vivian sat back, slightly eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in a kind of growing recognition. The kind of look you give when someone you didn't expect is suddenly exactly the person you need. Nathaniel felt it too. It wasn't just that she spoke the language, it was that she understood context, subtext, intention, all the invisible threads that hold human communication together. Vivian pushed the next page forward. Can you explain this section in plain English just to see how you process it? Amira scanned it. It was the part of the proposal that explained Carter BioWorks' ethical approach to data collection and patient privacy. After a few moments, she spoke. This part says the system doesn't store personal data, it only learns patterns. And every scan stays anonymous. So the AI doesn't know who it's looking at, just what it's looking for. It's like teaching it to recognize shadows, not faces. Nathaniel glanced at Vivian. That was accurate. More than that, it was well put. Amira hadn't just understood the text. She had interpreted it in a way that made it sound both simple and important. Vivian spoke gently. Where did you learn to think like that? Amira looked down for a moment, then answered in a voice that didn't try to sound bigger than it was. My mom used to make me explain things back to her. She said if I could teach it, then I really understood it. She'd ask about a chapter or a news article, or even just something someone said on TV. I had to tell it back to her like I was telling it to a younger kid. If I got it wrong, we'd go over it again. Nathaniel's chest tightened slightly. It wasn't pity. It was something harder to name. Respect, maybe. Or the early pull of belief. This child had not just been loved, she had been prepared. Amira glanced between the two adults, then asked something she hadn't before. If I do this, what happens after? Vivian leaned in. After the meeting. No, Amira said softly. After it works. If they invest, if the AI gets built, does it go where people really need it, or just where people can pay for it? Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He studied her, realizing that she wasn't asking to be clever or confrontational. She wanted to know why her voice would matter in this room, not just what it would accomplish. And that perhaps more than anything else she had said shifted something in him. If this works, he said carefully, we'll have the support to launch in clinics that need it most. Not just big hospitals, but rural areas, schools, small towns. That's the plan. That's the reason I started this company. Amira nodded once. Then I want to help. Vivian smiled gently. We'll get you ready. Amira stood up, gathered the papers, and followed Vivian down the hall. They led her to a guest dressing room left from the last company event, where a simple navy blue dress had been left hanging. Vivian offered it without ceremony. It's new. Still has tags. Might be a bit big, but it'll work. Amira took it without hesitation. She didn't look uncomfortable or embarrassed. She simply stepped into the room, changed, then emerged a few minutes later with her hair neatly tied back in a low bun. No makeup, no jewelry, just a child doing something far outside what anyone could expect of her, but somehow not out of place. Vivian handed her a small bottle of water. You'll be in the room with Nathaniel, Jean-Luc, and Adrian. You only translate. Don't try to change their words. Don't add your own. But if something doesn't make sense, ask. It's better to pause than to mislead. Amira nodded. Okay. Nathaniel checked his watch. 8:46. Time was closing in. The investors would arrive in less than 15 minutes. His chest felt tight, not with fear, but with pressure. He had risked billions of dollars in boardrooms before, but never had so much ridden on the steadiness of someone this small. They stood outside the meeting room door for a moment. The hallway was empty. Amira looked up at Nathaniel. Are they going to be mad when they see me? Nathaniel considered the question. He didn't lie. They might be surprised. Amira thought about that, then said, I don't mind surprise. I just don't want to disappoint. Nathaniel met her eyes. "You won't." The door remained closed. On the other side, polished oak tables, a 10-foot screen, and two of the most discerning minds in European investment were about to walk in, expecting professionalism, precision, and readiness. What they would see instead was a 12-year-old girl who had never been to a shareholders' meeting, never worn a business dress, never been asked to hold the future of a biotech firm in her hands. But what they didn't know, what only Nathaniel and Vivian had just begun to understand, was that this child had already survived something harder than any boardroom. She had learned to carry the weight of understanding and make it useful. She had learned to speak so that others might be heard. And as the final second ticked away, just before the door opened, Amira adjusted the hem of her dress, took a deep breath, and stood a little taller. The door to the boardroom opened with a quiet, deliberate click, and Amira stepped through. First, her frame small but steady, her hands folded in front of her with practiced calm. The room was sleek and composed polished oak table, reflecting the white light overhead chairs, arranged in precise symmetry, screen already lit with the Carter Bioworks logo. It was the kind of room where silence spoke first. Nathaniel followed just a pace behind, eyes fixed forward, his expression unreadable but firm. Vivian stood off to the side, her tablet already linked to the system running checks she didn't really need to run, just to keep her hands busy. At precisely 9 o'clock, the opposite door opened, and the two men they had been waiting for stepped in. Jean-Luc Moreau carried with him the stillness of someone used to being listened to. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, silver hair, neatly groomed suit, cut to perfection, but there was no vanity in his movements, just the quiet certainty of someone who had made difficult decisions for decades. Adrian Belland walked beside him, taller, leaner, his jaw tense, his expression already scanning the room like a man evaluating risk. His eyes moved quickly Vivian, the screen Nathaniel, and then stopped. He saw Amira. He paused. There was a beat of confusion and then a half-second too long of silence, the kind that settles in a room like cold air. Adrien turned to Jean-Luc and spoke in French, not bothering to lower his voice. "C'est elle l'interprète, c'est une plaisanterie." Translation: "That's the interpreter. Is this a joke?" The words weren't shouted. They didn't have to be. They were sharp, precise, and tinged with disbelief. A disbelief wrapped in the dry tone of someone who didn't think he needed to hide it. Vivian stiffened slightly. Nathaniel didn't react, at least not visibly. But Amira, she took half a step forward, turned to face Adrian, and spoke. Her French was smooth, controlled with the clarity of someone who had practiced not just pronunciation, but tone. "Je suis Amira James. Je vous remercie d'être ici. Je suis ici pour faciliter la communication si vous me le permettez." Which meant, "My name is Amira James. Thank you for being here. I'm here to help facilitate communication if you'll allow me." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't performative. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Her delivery was respectful, professional, and calm, far more measured than what most adults might have mustered under the same circumstances. The kind of tone that left no space for pity, only attention. Adrian blinked, not quite expecting a reply like that. Jean-Luc tilted his head slightly, his lips parting as if to speak, then choosing instead to remain quiet. He watched her more closely now, and for the first time with something other than skepticism, Nathaniel stepped beside Amira and addressed the room. "Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We'll begin promptly, and I believe what we share today will speak for itself." No one interrupted. Jean-Luc and Adrienne moved to their seats. Amira sat too, her posture still and upright, feet just barely brushing the floor. Vivian handed her a small microphone earpiece, which she adjusted quickly. There was no trace of nervous fumbling in her movements, only careful intention. Nathaniel launched into the presentation. His cadence was steady, every sentence clear. As he spoke, Amira began translating in real time, her French sharp, paced, and expressive. She didn't just mirror his words. She carried his meaning, adjusting her tone to match his intentions, choosing terms with clarity and precision. She spoke with the instinct of someone who understood that communication wasn't about parroting, it was about connecting. As they moved into the technical section on machine learning and medical diagnostics, Adrien asked a question in French, his tone crisp. "Et en cas d'erreur de diagnostic qui porte la responsabilité légale." That meant, and in the case of a misdiagnosis, who bears legal responsibility? It was a sharp question, fair, but pointed. He wanted to see how they'd handle liability, how the company would protect itself, and more importantly, patience. Amira took a breath before answering, not to stall, but to fully absorb the question. Then she repeated it in English to Nathaniel, making sure it was crystal clear. Nathaniel responded with a detailed explanation about Carter BioWorks' compliance with international standards, how the system was a support tool, not a decision-maker, and how doctors retained full control and accountability. Amira translated flawlessly, "Le système n'est pas autonome. Il assiste le médecin mais ne prend aucune décision finale." That meant the system is not autonomous. It assists the doctor, but does not make any final decisions. This was the moment Adrian stopped looking at her like a variable in a calculation and started treating her like a professional in the room. Jean-Luc, who had been silent for most of the presentation, leaned forward, fingers interlaced. He looked at Amira directly and asked in a softer voice, "Vous avez déjà travaillé comme interprète?" That meant, "Have you worked as an interpreter before?" Amira didn't hesitate. "Non, monsieur. Mais j'ai beaucoup étudié, et j'écoute avec soin." "No, sir, but I've studied a lot, and I listen carefully." There was a small silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Jean-Luc nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly, not a smile exactly, but close. The final stretch of the presentation moved through global deployment strategy and long-term scalability. Nathaniel described their partnership plan for non-profit clinics and how the technology could bring advanced diagnostics to underserved communities. Amira translated with even more confidence, now her voice growing in warmth. At one point, as Nathaniel spoke about the ethical principles behind the project, Amira added a phrase of her own. "Cette technologie n'est pas un remplacement de l'humanité, mais un soutien pour la sauver." It meant this technology is not a replacement for humanity, but a support to help save it. She hadn't been told to say that, but it landed. Vivian noticed Adrian's eyes shift ever so slightly. Jean-Luc leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. As the presentation concluded, Nathaniel thanked them both and asked if they had further questions. Adrian responded in English, now his tone neutral, but no longer dismissive. "Your presentation was strong, Mr. Carter, and your translator was unexpected." Nathaniel looked at Amira, offering her the space to speak, if she chose. She met Adrian's gaze without hesitation. "I know I wasn't what you expected," she said clearly, "but the information mattered. I just wanted to carry it clearly." Adrian didn't smile, but he gave the slightest nod. "You did." Jean-Luc stood collecting his papers. "We'll discuss and return shortly with our decision. Thank you all. And thank you, Mademoiselle James, for your clarity and professionalism." Amira rose from her chair, looked him in the eye, and said softly, "Merci pour votre écoute." Thank you for listening. This time, both men nodded without pause. As the door closed behind them, the room fell into a hush that didn't feel like tension anymore. It felt like release. Amira exhaled slowly, and for the first time all morning, her shoulders dropped a little. She had not asked to be believed. She had simply spoken. And somewhere in that space between disbelief and clarity, between assumption and attention respect, had taken root. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, then said in a low voice that barely broke the silence, "You didn't just hold your own. You turned the room." Amira offered a small smile. "That's what Mom used to say. If you can turn a room without raising your voice, you've really said something." And in that quiet moment, no headlines, no applause, no dramatic music, just a girl, a voice, and a room of decision-makers who now knew her name. Amira had taken the first real step into a world that had never expected her to be part of it. The room remained still for a few long seconds after the door closed behind Jean-Luc and Adrian, leaving only the soft hum of the ventilation system and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Amira stood by the end of the table, her back straight, her expression calm. But Nathaniel noticed the way her fingers brushed her palms, slow and deliberate, like someone grounding herself after walking a narrow bridge. Vivian gave her a small nod of approval, but said nothing. They all knew the hardest part wasn't over. It was shifting. The meeting had passed its first test respect, but now came the part that mattered more than reputation. Now came the part where lives could hang in the balance. Nathaniel turned to the screen again. "Let's move into the heart of the platform, what the AI actually does in a clinical setting." His voice stayed steady, but there was a softness around the edges, now a subtle lowering of tempo. He clicked to the next slide. A series of high-resolution images appeared side-by-side comparisons of lung scans, one column labeled normal tissue, the other early-stage anomaly. The visuals were stark but precise. This is a patient in the early stages of pulmonary sarcoidosis, barely symptomatic. No cough, no fatigue. It was caught during a routine screening. Our AI flagged the anomaly in less than 20 seconds. He paused to let that register. Amira translated into French, her voice now carrying a different weight, not assertive like before, but almost intimate, as if she were guiding the listener through something personal. Voici un patient atteint de sarcoïdose pulmonaire à un stade précoce. Aucune fatigue, rien d'évident, mais l'intelligence artificielle a détecté l'anomalie en moins de 20 secondes. Her tone slowed just slightly on that final phrase, en moins de 20 secondes, as if the brevity of time carried the depth of its own implication. The air in the room shifted again more subtly than before. Adrienne's gaze fixed on the scan, while Jean-Luc leaned forward, just a fraction, elbows resting on the edge of the table. Nathaniel clicked again. We've trained the system on over 500,000 anonymized cases across 7 countries and 5 major ethnic groups. The AI doesn't guess, it learns. It learns the way a seasoned physician does, but with the ability to detect microscopic patterns in a sea of normal. He looked at Amira for just a half second before continuing, but data isn't enough. The real value comes when a tool like this can be used by the people who need it most: nurses, field medics, community clinics. Amira began translating again, but this time she adjusted her phrasing, not changing meaning, but feeling. Nous avons entraîné le système sur plus de 500 000 cas anonymes dans ce pays, mais la vraie valeur n'est pas dans les chiffres, elle est dans l'impact. L'outil n'est utile que s'il atteint ceux qui n'ont pas toujours accès aux spécialistes, les infirmières, les cliniques rurales, les familles ordinaires. Her voice softened slightly on familles ordinaires, ordinary families, and Vivian caught it immediately. This wasn't just translation. This was a choice. Amira was telling a story inside a story, using tone and rhythm to turn data into something human. As Nathaniel walked through a case study from Brazil where the system had helped identify a misdiagnosed heart condition in a child under 10, Amira's eyes briefly flicked to the screen and then back to the table. When she translated his words, she added a pause, a breath of silence, before the final line. Et si qu'elle avait été trop tard si personne ne l'avait vu, si l'enfant n'avait pas été revu. What if it had been too late? What if no one had seen it? What if the child had never been re-examined? She didn't linger on the questions, but she didn't rush through them either. The words sat in the air like the echo of something more than hypothetical. Jean-Luc glanced up from the printed deck in front of him. How accessible is this platform to underfunded hospitals, he asked, this time in English. Not the pilot cities, the forgotten ones. Nathaniel nodded. That's part of the long-term roadmap. We're already in talks with 3 non-profit hospital networks, including one in rural Arkansas and another in northern Senegal. The model is designed for low-bandwidth environments. Updates can be made offline and synced later. It doesn't need constant connectivity. That was a non-negotiable for us. As Amira translated, her voice didn't just echo the logistics, it gave them shape. Le système ne dépend pas de la connexion. Continue. Il est conçu pour les hôpitaux sans ressources. Les mises à jour peuvent être installées hors ligne puis synchronisées. C'est une condition essentielle. Parce que tout le monde mérite d'être vu à temps. That last line, everyone deserves to be seen in time, was not in the slide deck. It wasn't even in Nathaniel's original phrasing. It was Amira's, and no one corrected her. Nathaniel stepped aside and pulled up the final case. This one wasn't a success story. It was a patient whose condition hadn't been caught in time. A woman in her 40s, no prior diagnosis, died within 2 months of initial symptoms. Her scan, when reviewed later, showed early signs the system would have flagged. We're not showing this to dramatize, he said. We're showing it because this happens every day. And we have the tools to change that. Amira paused for a moment before she began the French version. When she spoke, her voice was different. Not louder, not softer, just closer. Ce n'est pas pour faire peur. C'est pour être honnête. Cette femme n'a pas été diagnostiquée à temps. Et maintenant elle est morte. Pourtant les signes étaient là. L'intelligence artificielle les aurait vus. C'est ça le vrai enjeu. Then she added without waiting for a cue, just quietly, with a steadiness that didn't ask for attention, but held it anyway. Si ma mère avait été diagnostiquée plus tôt, je serais peut-être encore en train de lire du français avec elle. Translation: If my mother had been diagnosed earlier, maybe I'd still be reading French with her today. The room didn't move. Adrian didn't blink. Jean-Luc's hands were clasped, unmoving on the table. No one spoke for several seconds. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because for once the numbers, the models, the forecasts, they weren't the center anymore. A 12-year-old girl had just turned their investment pitch into something they couldn't budget against grief, hope, memory. Vivian swallowed slowly, her eyes not leaving Amira. Nathaniel looked down, adjusting a pen that didn't need adjusting. And Amira, she didn't look at anyone. She just took a sip of water and turned the page in the printout as if what she had said wasn't extraordinary, but simply necessary. The meeting continued, technically speaking. But from that point on, the energy had changed. The two men across the table stopped looking at slides and started looking at Amira when she spoke. Not because she was a child or because she was the surprise of the day, but because her voice now carried something they hadn't expected to find in a corporate office on a Thursday morning, something so often missing in conversations about innovation and impact. Her voice carried truth. And in that moment, every sentence she translated wasn't just information, it was a bridge. Between their expectations and the world they had forgotten existed. Between data and the humans it could save. Between her mother who had died without early detection and the millions of mothers who still had a chance. Jean-Luc and Adrienne returned to the room without their folders. The decision had been made. They took their seats with the same calm demeanor as before, but there was something slightly different in the air now, more deliberate, more sealed. Nathaniel closed his laptop and folded his hands, his face unreadable. Vivian, still standing, glanced briefly at Amira before focusing back on the men across the table. Adrian adjusted his cufflink as if to signal finality, then spoke clearly and without preamble. "We are prepared to move forward with a commitment of $200 million, he said, but we would ask for an adjusted equity position 51% to ensure accountability and oversight. In addition, the final product rollout will be subject to strategic licensing controlled by our board." The words landed without drama, but their weight was immediate. 51% control, oversight, strategic licensing. Nathaniel didn't flinch, but his fingers pressed together just slightly tighter. Vivian didn't speak, though her jaw tightened. Amira, seated beside Nathaniel, looked from one face to another, unsure at first what the words fully meant, but sensing with alarming clarity that something had shifted. It wasn't just a business move, it was a tilt of power. Nathaniel nodded slowly, not agreeing, but acknowledging. "Thank you." "That's generous," he said, voice measured, "though I'll admit I wasn't expecting a controlling stake." Adrian gave a faint shrug. "It's not about control for its own sake, it's about risk. We've seen too many promising technologies fail because the visionaries refused accountability. We offer structure, reach, credibility. This will take your idea global." Jean-Luc, quieter, simply added, "This isn't a rejection of your mission, Mr. Carter. It's how we make sure it survives." The room was quiet for a moment. Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. There was a shift in the energy, one that Amira felt without fully understanding the financial mechanics. But she saw it in Nathaniel's posture, in Vivian's silence, and in the careful wording of Jean-Luc. It didn't feel like partnership. It felt like possession. She looked toward Nathaniel, waiting for him to respond, but instead found her own hand rising. No one asked her to speak. She didn't look for permission. She just felt that the moment needed something different than what had been offered, something not written on paper. "Can I ask something?" Amira said quietly. All eyes turned toward her. Adrian looked almost amused. Jean-Luc raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course." Amira sat up, a little straighter voice, calm but unshaken. "Did you ever dream something so big it scared you?" Her eyes didn't wander. She looked directly at Adrian, then at Jean-Luc. Not because it was unrealistic, but because it felt too important to get wrong. The room didn't move. "I think sometimes grown-ups forget," she continued, "what it felt like to care about something before it had a price. Before it needed approval, before it had shareholders and legal teams and marketing plans, just a dream about helping someone or changing something." Adrian's face stayed still, but his fingers slowly interlaced. Jean-Luc leaned back slightly, watching her now without the filter of negotiation. "I don't understand all the business parts," Amira said, "but I know when someone believes in something and when someone wants to own it." She paused. "Dreams don't need owners. They need believers." Vivian took a slow breath, barely audible. Nathaniel remained silent, not out of discomfort, but because he knew better than to interrupt a moment like this. Amira hadn't rehearsed any of it. Her voice was steady, but her words carried a rawness that couldn't be faked. It wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. Jean-Luc tapped his knuckles once on the table, thoughtful. He looked at Amira, then at Nathaniel, then down at his hands. When I was 30, Jean-Luc said, voice lower, slower than before I started a free clinic in Lyon. 1 room, 2 beds. I ran it evenings and weekends after hours at the hospital. We treated anyone who walked in, didn't ask about documents, didn't ask if they could pay. He gave a soft, almost self-mocking smile. It ran out of funding in 16 months. I told myself I'd find another way to make impact. So I went into investment, to build from the top. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a faint echo of something he'd packed away a long time ago. Adrian didn't speak at first. He just watched the table, then slowly leaned forward. My brother died of liver failure when he was 24. We were a family of engineers. We assumed intelligence would protect us from tragedy. It didn't. His voice was matter-of-fact, but a thin line of grief sat just beneath it. I left banking because I didn't want to just build portfolios. I wanted to build something real, something that would outlast us. There was a pause after he finished. Not awkward, just honest. Amira looked at both men and said nothing. She didn't need to. The room was doing its own work now. Nathaniel finally broke the silence. His voice was soft but clear. I didn't build this company to sell it. I built it because I watched my mother wait 6 months for a diagnosis that should have taken 20 minutes. And because I believe technology could make healthcare more human, not less. Adrian nodded once. We're not trying to take it from you. Nathaniel replied, not defensively, but directly. But you're asking me to give up the right to decide where it goes. That's not partnership. That's custody. Jean-Luc folded his hands again. And what would you propose instead? Nathaniel looked at Amira for a long moment, then back at them. Shared authority, joint control of rollout, transparent oversight, and a clause that guarantees access for underserved regions regardless of market performance. Vivian added, we can write it, and we can make it binding. Adrian didn't answer right away. He looked at Amira again. You've made quite the impression. I didn't mean to, she said. I just didn't want you to forget what this is about. Jean-Luc stood slowly. Let us reconsider the structure. This deserves more than numbers. Adrian stood beside him. We'll return this afternoon with something better. As they walked out, there was no dramatic shift, no final decision. But the balance had changed, not because of leverage or legal language, because someone reminded the room gently, firmly, that behind every chart was a person, and behind every decision, a reason. When the door closed, Vivian let out a long breath. She just rewrote the mood of the entire deal. Nathaniel looked at Amira. That's the second time today you've changed everything with a sentence. Amira gave a small, tired smile. I didn't change it. You all remembered it. And in that quiet, reflective pause, the adults in the room, all of them realized they hadn't just been negotiating a contract. They had been negotiating with their own past, with the versions of themselves that once believed they could change something. And Amira, simply by speaking with the honesty only a child could carry, without fear, had handed that version back to them intact. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Jean-Luc and Adrian returned. The light in the room had changed. Longer shadows stretched across the polished floor, and outside the glass, the late afternoon sun softened the edges of the skyline. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table again, but this time with his jacket off, sleeves rolled, and expression level. Vivian was seated to his right, notebook, closed hands gently clasped, as if waiting for the tone to be set. Amira sat quietly to Nathaniel's left, her chair slightly too big for her still, but her presence by now no longer felt out of place. No one introduced them again. There was no need. These weren't strangers returning for negotiation. They were people walking back into a conversation they hadn't realized they needed to finish earlier that day. Jean-Luc placed a single folder on the table and remained standing. We've revisited our proposal, he said, without drama. This time not from the position of ownership, but from partnership. He looked first to Nathaniel, then to Vivian, then deliberately to Amira. We're increasing our offer to $200 million. No change in the original equity structure. Carter Bioworks retains controlling interest. Nathaniel didn't move. Neither did Vivian. The silence was purposeful, not stunned, just making sure nothing had been misunderstood. Adrian spoke next. We're also withdrawing our licensing conditions. Distribution remains your team's call. With one caveat. He paused. Amira lifted her eyes calmly. Adrian looked directly at her. We want her involved, not as a mascot, not for headlines, but because we believe this mission needs someone who remembers who it's for." Vivian narrowed her gaze slightly. "Define involved." Jean-Luc answered, "We propose Amira be invited to serve as youth liaison for the project's international rollout. That means attending selected community launches, participating in design feedback for user experience from a non-technical perspective, and helping us shape messaging that actually reaches people." Nathaniel looked at Amira, then at the men across the table. "She's 12. Jean-Luc nodded, "And that's exactly why it matters. No corporate strategist would have said what she said this morning. And no boardroom conversation we've ever had has moved this clearly. People won't just listen to her, they'll feel why this matters." There was a beat of silence. Adrian added, "We're not offering her a job. We're inviting her to be part of something real if she wants it." All eyes turned toward Amira. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't beam, didn't shy away. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the table and sat up a little straighter. "Can I ask something first?" she said. Jean-Luc smiled faintly. "Please do. If I go to those events," she began, "will I be able to speak to the kids? Not just stand next to cameras or say things someone writes for me, but actually speak, like we're talking now." Adrian replied without hesitation, "Yes, you can speak freely. And will I have a say if something doesn't feel right, if the tech is too hard to understand, or if someone in the room is being left out?" Jean-Luc's voice was steady. "You'll be at the table. That's what we're asking." Amira nodded once. "Then I'll do it, but only if the goal stays the same. I'll help if it helps more kids, not if it's just for cameras." There was a silence then. Not stunned, not awkward, just full. The kind that feels like the last click of a puzzle piece fitting into place. Nathaniel exhaled, not loudly, but deeply. The kind of breath that comes after hours of holding everything together. Vivian leaned back slightly, then reached into her bag, pulled out a clean notepad, and began scribbling draft terms as Jean-Luc slid the folder across the table. Adrian sat down at last, his tone more relaxed now, but not casual. "We'll have our legal team coordinate with yours. We'd like the youth liaison clause to be formal, not symbolic." Amira didn't speak again. She didn't need to. What had needed to be said was already said. Instead, she pulled her glass of water closer and took a small sip, listening now, not as a child watching grown-ups talk, but as someone whose presence had shaped what the grown-ups would say. What no one said but everyone understood was that the terms had shifted far beyond the numbers. This was no longer a deal about product and distribution. It was a recognition that integrity can be led by someone without a title, that sometimes a dream needs a reminder of where it began in order to survive the weight of what it's becoming. Vivian passed her draft notes to Nathaniel, who skimmed them silently, then nodded in agreement. He looked at Amira once more and said, with simple sincerity, "Looks like you just got promoted." Amira didn't laugh. She just looked back at him and said softly, "Then I hope I can do it right." Jean-Luc stood again, extending a hand to Nathaniel. "Let's build something that's worth remembering." They shook hands. No cameras, no press, just the sound of 4 adults and a child turning an agreement into something more than business. As they exited, Adrian stopped beside Amira. He didn't kneel or try to lower his voice. He just looked her in the eye and said, "You reminded me of who I wanted to be when I started. Thank you for that." Amira replied simply, "Then maybe just keep being that." He smiled and with a slight nod stepped out of the room. After they were gone, the room felt different. Not just relieved, not just successful, but settled, like something good had been done and done without compromise. Nathaniel looked toward Vivian. "Let's get legal moving and prep for announcement protocol, but keep it quiet for now." She nodded, "Of course." Then he looked at Amira and asked, "You okay?" Amira answered with a quiet yes, then after a moment added, "I think so. It feels not over, just starting." Nathaniel smiled. "Exactly." And in that moment, without ceremony or applause, the most important agreement of the day wasn't the 200 million or the equity or the rollout. It was a mutual commitment between adults and a girl, between structure and spirit, to protect something rare, a dream that belonged to everyone, not because it was claimed, but because it was shared. The call came just after 5. Christopher James was finishing up in the boiler room, replacing a cracked valve behind a panel that hadn't been opened in years. His hands were still dirty when the front desk rang through, saying someone named Vivian wanted to speak with him immediately. She didn't give many details, just asked if he could come to the executive floor as soon as possible. The executive floor. He wiped his hands on an old rag he kept in his back pocket, hesitated for a moment, then started walking. The freight elevator took longer than usual. As he stood inside, still in his Navy maintenance uniform with his name embroidered on the chest, he tried not to imagine the worst. Maybe something happened to Amira. Maybe she fainted. Maybe they had pushed her too hard. She should have been reading books today. She should have been home by now. By the time the doors opened on the 25th floor, his heart was thudding hard enough for him to feel it in his ears. The space outside the elevator was pristine, almost silent, bathed in golden afternoon light that made everything feel strangely delicate. Vivian met him near the hallway and greeted him with a nod that was polite but not formal. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Carter would like to speak with you. And so would your daughter." She gestured gently toward the glass-walled conference room. Christopher stepped inside slowly. Amira was there, seated at the far end of the table, with a glass of water in front of her, looking tired but composed. Nathaniel stood beside her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on the back of a chair. When Amira saw her father, she stood immediately. She didn't run to him, didn't cry. She simply walked over and took his hand. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "I'm okay." He studied her face carefully. "You sure?" She nodded. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Nathaniel extended his hand. "Mr. James, thank you for coming up." Christopher shook it, then looked around the room. He didn't sit. "Someone gonna tell me what's going on?" Vivian stepped in, her tone calm. "Your daughter helped us secure a multi-million-dollar investment this afternoon." Christopher blinked. "Excuse me?" She stepped in as an interpreter, in real time, with two French investors who almost walked. She didn't just translate. She changed the direction of the negotiation. He looked down at Amira. She didn't say anything, just held his hand a little tighter. She was poised, accurate, emotionally intelligent, Nathaniel added. She reminded everyone in that room what this technology is actually about. Christopher let go of her hand gently and rubbed his forehead. "She's 12. Yes," Nathaniel said without flinching. "And she's also the reason this company just moved forward." Christopher exhaled slowly, then finally sat down. He looked at his daughter again, searching her face for signs of pressure, fear, confusion. He didn't find any. She met his gaze directly. "They asked me to help again," Amira said. "They want me to be part of it, not forever, just to help other kids understand what this thing can do. To speak for people who don't usually get to speak." "You want to?" he asked. She nodded. "If it's real, if it actually helps people." Christopher looked back at Nathaniel. "You gonna take care of her?" "Absolutely," Nathaniel said. "No media circus, no exploitation. She sets the limits." Jean-Luc and Adrien entered a moment later, having been briefed that Christopher had arrived. They greeted him respectfully, and to his credit, Christopher stood and shook both their hands. He didn't smile, but he didn't bristle either. Jean-Luc spoke first. "Mr. James, your daughter didn't just assist us. She redirected us. Her words reminded me why I ever got into medicine. I hope you know what a rare voice she has." Christopher didn't respond immediately. Then slowly he nodded. "I do." Adrien added, "She's part of the reason we're investing, not as a child on stage, but as a perspective we've been missing." There was a long pause. Then Christopher looked at Amira. She looked at him. He said only this: "You've always been the best thing I've ever built." Her eyes filled instantly, but she blinked it back. She stepped closer and leaned against him just for a second. He didn't wrap his arms around her or make a show of it. He just let her rest there in quiet. And for a moment, no one in the room moved, not out of politeness, but out of respect. Because in a tower built of glass and steel, among people with money and power and purpose, the most solid thing in that room was the quiet pride of a man who had spent 12 years cleaning the floors beneath their feet, raising a daughter who could look them in the eye and speak truth without fear. The call came just after 5. Christopher James was finishing up in the boiler room, replacing a cracked valve behind a panel that hadn't been opened in years. His hands were still dirty when the front desk rang through, saying someone named Vivian wanted to speak with him immediately. She didn't give many details, just asked if he could come to the executive floor as soon as possible. The executive floor. He wiped his hands on an old rag he kept in his back pocket, hesitated for a moment, then started walking. The freight elevator took longer than usual. As he stood inside, still in his Navy maintenance uniform with his name embroidered on the chest, he tried not to imagine the worst. Maybe something happened to Amira. Maybe she fainted. Maybe they had pushed her too hard. She should have been reading books today. She should have been home by now. By the time the doors opened on the 25th floor, his heart was thudding hard enough for him to feel it in his ears. The space outside the elevator was pristine, almost silent, bathed in golden afternoon light that made everything feel strangely delicate. Vivian met him near the hallway and greeted him with a nod that was polite but not formal. "Thank you for coming. Mr. Carter would like to speak with you. And so would your daughter." She gestured gently toward the glass-walled conference room. Christopher stepped inside slowly. Amira was there, seated at the far end of the table, with a glass of water in front of her, looking tired but composed. Nathaniel stood beside her, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on the back of a chair. When Amira saw her father, she stood immediately. She didn't run to him, didn't cry. She simply walked over and took his hand. "Hi, Dad," she said softly. "I'm okay." He studied her face carefully. "You sure?" She nodded. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Nathaniel extended his hand. "Mr. James, thank you for coming up." Christopher shook it, then looked around the room. He didn't sit. "Someone gonna tell me what's going on?" Vivian stepped in, her tone calm. "Your daughter helped us secure a multi-million-dollar investment this afternoon." Christopher blinked. "Excuse me." She stepped in as an interpreter, in real time. With two French investors who almost walked, she didn't just translate. She changed the direction of the negotiation. He looked down at Amira. She didn't say anything, just held his hand a little tighter. She was poised, accurate, emotionally intelligent, Nathaniel added. She reminded everyone in that room what this technology is actually about. Christopher let go of her hand gently and rubbed his forehead. "She's 12. "Yes," Nathaniel said without flinching. "And she's also the reason this company just moved forward." Christopher exhaled slowly, then finally sat down. He looked at his daughter again, searching her face for signs of pressure, fear, confusion. He didn't find any. She met his gaze directly. Still inside, his mind was racing, trying to reconcile the quiet, observant child who spent evenings reading French poetry on their worn-out couch with the girl who now sat in a corporate boardroom, apparently having helped swing a deal worth more money than he could even comprehend. A part of him felt protective, worried this world could spin her too fast. Another part, deeper and quieter, felt something else he hadn't let himself feel in years, pride, vast and humbling. "They asked me to help again," Amira said. "They want me to be part of it. Not forever. Just to help other kids understand what this thing can do. To speak for people who don't usually get to speak." "You want to?" he asked. She nodded. "If it's real. If it actually helps people." Christopher looked back at Nathaniel. "You gonna take care of her?" "Absolutely," Nathaniel said. "No media circus, no exploitation. She sets the limits." Jean-Luc and Adrian entered a moment later, having been briefed that Christopher had arrived. They greeted him respectfully, and to his credit, Christopher stood and shook both their hands. He didn't smile, but he didn't bristle either. Jean-Luc spoke first. "Mr. James, your daughter didn't just assist us. She redirected us. Her words reminded me why I ever got into medicine. I hope you know what a rare voice she has." Christopher didn't respond immediately. Then slowly, he nodded. "I do." Adrian added, "She's part of the reason we're investing. Not as a child on stage, but as a perspective we've been missing." There was a long pause. Then Christopher looked at Amira. She looked at him. In that moment, all the mornings he had woken up early to pack her lunch, all the nights he had tiptoed into her room after late shifts, just to make sure she was breathing, all the tiny moments of invisible fatherhood collided with this one image, his daughter calm and composed in a room of executives and doctors and powerful men speaking with clarity and compassion. For years, he had wondered if he was doing enough, if loving her quietly was enough. Now, looking at her, he realized something vital. She had become someone who didn't just reflect his values, she carried them forward. He said, "Only this. You've always been the best thing I've ever built." Her eyes filled instantly, but she blinked it back. She stepped closer and leaned against him, just for a second. He didn't wrap his arms around her or make a show of it. He just let her rest there in quiet. And for a moment, no one in the room moved, not out of politeness, but out of respect. Because in a tower built of glass and steel, among people with money and power and purpose, the most solid thing in that room was the quiet pride of a man who had spent 12 years cleaning the floors beneath their feet, raising a daughter who could look them in the eye and speak truth without fear. The echo of Christopher's footsteps hadn't quite faded when another presence quietly entered the lounge. Catherine Lemaire, senior advisor to the International Board, renowned for her strategic mind and decades of diplomatic finesse, stepped into the room with a composure that masked a tremor in her chest. She had spent the better part of her life navigating boardrooms and negotiations with presidents and diplomats, yet nothing had prepared her for what she had seen today. During the high-stakes pitch, as she sat observing in the background, her gaze had locked onto something unexpected. It wasn't the technology. It wasn't the investment offer. It was the necklace, a small silver pendant around the neck of the young girl, translating with startling fluency. A pendant she hadn't seen in more than 20 years. Catherine had excused herself shortly after the meeting ended, claiming an urgent call. But the truth was far more personal. The phrase engraved on that pendant tout, "Si que je suis, je le dois à l'amour," had once belonged to her grandmother, then passed down to her younger sister Marie. Seeing it now worn by a girl whose voice carried both innocence and steel shook Catherine in a way she didn't understand until she sat in the stillness of her office. She had to know. Not as an executive, as a sister who had once closed the door on family. Now, as she entered the room, she saw the girl seated alone by the window. Amira. Small, composed, clearly tired, yet dignified in the way only children forced to grow up too early tend to be. Catherine paused a few feet away, careful not to intrude too quickly. Nathaniel, who had lingered to check in on Amira, turned to her with a raised brow. "Catherine," he said quietly, "back so soon I never left, really." She replied, "I needed a moment, and now I need one more with her." Nathaniel looked to Amira, who nodded slightly. Catherine approached. "May I sit?" "Yes." Amira said, her voice calm but watchful. Catherine took the seat opposite her. For a moment, she just looked, not at the child, but at the face, the eyes, the shape of the mouth. Echoes of Marie everywhere. "I saw your pendant," Catherine began softly. "Earlier, during the meeting." Amira touched it reflexively. "It was my mom's." Catherine leaned in just enough to see the inscription. Her breath caught. "She got that from my grandmother. That phrase. We grew up hearing it." Amira tilted her head, something shifting in her posture. "Your grandmother," Catherine nodded. "My name is Catherine Lemaire. I was Marie's sister." The words hung there. Amira blinked once, twice. She didn't react with shock. She processed. "She told me she had a sister, but she never said you were still close." "We weren't," Catherine admitted. "And that was my doing. When she chose to leave France to be with your father, I said terrible things. I told her not to come back. I thought I was protecting our name, our standing. But what I was really doing was abandoning the person who loved me most." "She never said anything bad about you," Amira said. "Not once." Catherine's composure cracked, just slightly. "She didn't know. She said you were brave, that you used to read to her in the attic and sing when she had nightmares. She said she missed you every day." Catherine closed her eyes, then opened them again. "I missed her too, but I buried it. I thought I had time. I thought, someday." And then someday was too late. They sat in silence. Outside, the lights of the city flickered into the night. Inside, the past and present collided quietly between them. Amira took off the necklace and held it out. "She told me this was a gift, that it wasn't just jewelry. It was a reminder of who she was and where she came from." Catherine stared at the pendant but didn't take it. "It belongs with you." That phrase was meant to guide us when we forgot who we were. And right now, I see more of her in you than I ever saw in myself. Amira's voice dropped to a near whisper. "She said you were the smartest person she knew." Catherine laughed gently, bitterly. "Smart enough to push away the person I loved most. But maybe brave enough now to try again?" Amira asked. The question wasn't childish. It was generous. Catherine nodded slowly. "If you'll let me." They sat quietly, and then, with the trust of someone who had spent her life hoping for a piece of family to come back, Amira reached across the small table and took Catherine's hand. "I think she would have wanted that. I think she sent you to remind me." In that room, in that small moment, a chapter that had never been written between two sisters began to find its continuation through the steady hands of a daughter. Catherine stayed a while longer that night, not as an advisor, not as a woman of position, but as someone finally ready to show up for the only family she had left. Amira, exhausted, but somehow lighter, leaned back in her chair. She didn't need to say much more. Sometimes being seen was enough. And for the first time in over 20 years, Catherine allowed herself to truly see. The following morning carried the kind of stillness that only comes after a night full of truths. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but inside the conference floor of the headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted. Not in the dramatic sense, there was no applause or headlines, just a subtle change in posture, in glances exchanged, in the weight people gave to their words. And it began with Catherine. She had not slept much, if at all, but her steps were calm as she walked into the meeting suite, where Nathaniel, Adrien, Jean-Luc, and Vivian were quietly reviewing the prior day's financials. Amira was there too, curled up with a book far too advanced for most 12-year-olds, yet somehow entirely appropriate for her. Christopher stood behind her chair, not hovering, but present, arms loosely crossed, his eyes observant and grounded. Catherine cleared her throat softly. "I'd like to propose something." All eyes turned to her. She didn't pace. She didn't present. She simply spoke. "I've been thinking about legacy and about consequence. Not in the abstract way we use those terms during end-of-quarter reviews or capital allocation debates. I mean it in the human sense, what we leave behind when we're no longer in the room or no longer alive." Nathaniel gave her his full attention. He already sensed she wasn't talking about numbers. Catherine continued. "Years ago, our foundation purchased a decommissioned pediatric hospital in the Northeast District. We had intended to convert it into administrative storage, then later a training site. But it's remained unused, too expensive to retrofit, too sentimental for many of us to repurpose." She paused, looking directly at Amira. "That's where Marie was treated, where she spent her last weeks." The room was still. Amira's eyes lifted slowly, meeting Catherine's with a deep steadiness. There was no resentment there, no demand, just attention. "I don't want it to be storage," Catherine said. "I want it to mean something again. I'd like to propose we turn it into a living project, an AI-integrated pediatric center. One that uses early diagnostic tools, real-time family support models, and ethical technology to help families like Marie's, like Amira's." Jean-Luc tilted his head, intrigued but cautious. "What scale are we talking?" "Smaller than a full hospital," Catherine explained, "but large enough to pilot what we believe in: compassionate medicine powered by precise technology. It wouldn't just be research, it would be care, outreach, healing." Adrien leaned forward. "And you want it under the company?" "I want it under our conscience," she replied, not flinching. "Backed by us, yes, but driven by a coalition, not a corporate arm. Doctors, developers, educators, community leaders." She looked at Nathaniel. "And I want Amira involved, not for optics, not as a mascot, but because she understands what this means better than anyone in this room." Everyone looked to Amira. She sat very still for a moment, then lowered the book onto her lap. "I'm not a scientist," she said carefully. "I don't know how to build machines." Nathaniel smiled. "You know how to remind people why we should." Amira looked at her father, then back at Catherine. "If it helps other kids feel seen like my mom did for me, then yes, I'll be part of it." Catherine nodded, her throat tight. "You won't be alone. We'll build it around the values she taught you, that you've shown us." There was a beat of quiet before Christopher spoke. "If you're going to serve working families, you'll need someone who actually knows what they go through, not just in theory. On the ground." Catherine turned to him. "Are you offering?" He nodded. "I've mopped floors in clinics, in ERs. I've waited hours outside with no answers. I know how hard it is to be heard when your uniform tells people you clean up after them." Vivian, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Then we should start by making that part of the design. Not just accessibility, dignity, from the parking lot to the pharmacy." A current moved through the room. Not excitement, commitment. Jean-Luc finally broke the thoughtful silence. $200 million, full backing, on the condition it remains community-centered, not profit-driven, Adrien added, and that it shares its research findings openly with oversight. Nathaniel extended his hand across the table. Done. The decision wasn't followed by celebration. It didn't need to be. What mattered was what came next. Later that afternoon, Amira and Catherine visited the old building. The doors were sealed with rusted chains, the windows clouded with dust, but the bones of something good were still there. Amira walked slowly through the corridor where her mother had once smiled despite the pain. She stopped at a room where the tile had cracked in the corner, sunlight catching on the old linoleum. Catherine stood behind her. This place saw too much sorrow. It deserves a second chapter. Amira turned to her, voice soft but firm. "Let's write it right this time." And so they did, not with speeches or slogans, but with drawings, drafts, consultations, and quiet conversations with nurses who remembered Marie, with children who would one day benefit, and with architects who listened instead of dictated. It would take months, maybe years, but the first stone had been laid, not in concrete, in conviction, and that was enough to begin. The week that followed, the announcement of the Pediatric AI Center was unlike anything Amira or anyone around her had experienced before. At first, it was a trickle, one or two reporters lingering outside the building, gates a few polite requests for interviews sent to the Foundation's inbox. But by the third day, it had become a flood. Cameras lined the sidewalk, microphones pointed like weapons of attention, and headlines plastered Amira's face across news sites and morning television segments. They called her many things: the girl who healed a company, the voice of a generation, a miracle in sneakers. But none of those words belonged to her. Inside the old hospital building, still under renovation, Amira sat quietly on an overturned supply crate, her back leaning against a window frame stripped of glass. She was holding a children's storybook, something light, something full of color, but her eyes weren't moving across the page. They were watching the dust dance in a beam of afternoon light, her thoughts drifting somewhere slower, somewhere quieter. Catherine approached gently, her heels clicking against the cement floor, then pausing before they reached Amira. She didn't want to startle her. "You okay with all this?" she asked, her voice low but concerned. Amira looked up. Her eyes were calm, but not carefree. "It's strange. When I was younger, I thought if I ever got on the news, it'd be for something I did at school, or something I built, not because I talked." Catherine sat down beside her, brushing the edge of her coat beneath her legs. "You didn't just talk. You reminded people why the truth matters. That's not small." Amira nodded, but her fingers remained motionless on the book. "But now, everyone wants me to keep talking, even when I don't have anything new to say." That evening, a packet arrived at the main office addressed to Amira. It contained a contract from a global publishing house offering to option her story for a book deal, complete with a pre-written summary titled "Little Hero of Silicon Hearts." The next day, a popular athletic brand delivered a custom pair of sneakers with her name stitched on the heel. A fashion magazine called to ask for a photo shoot. There were offers for appearances on talk shows, TED-style platforms, youth leadership summits, and even an animated film proposal. Every letter started the same way: "We are inspired by Amira and her story." Christopher was the first to read the letters with narrowed eyes. He didn't raise his voice or shake his head, but his chest tightened slightly as he watched his daughter read through the proposals with a curious but distant expression. Vivian scheduled a private meeting with Amira, Catherine, Nathaniel, and Christopher. Around the conference table, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Catherine opened the discussion carefully. "Amira, none of this has to happen if you're not comfortable. You owe the world nothing." Amira looked around the room, then at the papers in her hands. "Why does everyone think I'm supposed to represent something I'm just trying to keep a promise to my mom?" Nathaniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. "They see hope in you. And people try to package hope when they're afraid of losing it." Amira tilted her head. "But packaging isn't the same as sharing." Christopher finally spoke. "You don't have to be anything more than who you are. You already changed more than you know, and that's enough." Later that week, at a press Kwanda held outside the hospital renovation site, a reporter asked her, "Amira, how do you feel about being called the future of ethical tech?" She took a slow breath before answering, her voice steady. "I don't know what the future looks like yet, but I do know sick kids don't need more speeches. They need nurses who have time to sit beside them. If I get to grow up, I want to be someone who makes that easier, not someone who makes headlines." That quote made headlines, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't followed by brand deals or glossy profiles. It triggered conversations, real ones, about how we treat children who speak out about the line between recognition and exploitation, and about the difference between spotlight and purpose. The next morning, Amira returned to the center with a stack of picture books in her backpack. She spent the afternoon reading to a group of kids in the newly painted East Wing, her voice rising and falling in rhythm with the pages, the children laughing and leaning in. No cameras, no interviews, just presence. Later, while helping her father distribute home-cooked meals to families waiting in the lobby, she glanced up at a quiet corner where her mother's photo had been temporarily placed on a staff memorial board. Christopher followed her gaze, then gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "She'd be proud," he said. Amira didn't answer right away. She just smiled, then turned to the next family waiting for food. Whatever the world called her symbol miracle prodigy, she would answer only to the truth she carried. And that truth didn't need a spotlight. It just needed to keep moving forward. The morning of the center's opening ceremony arrived without spectacle, but with quiet expectation. The sun filtered in gently through the hospital's newly installed skylights, illuminating a space that had once known silence and endings, now polished and prepared for beginnings. The old linoleum floors had been replaced with soft, light oak. The walls, once beige and chipped, now bore murals designed by local children, whales, stars, forests, and faces. Nurses moved about in crisp uniforms with new name badges, but their laughter and cadence showed they were still the same people who had once stood vigil in this place. Outside, rows of chairs had been set up beneath a wide tent. There was no red carpet, no corporate banner. Just a small wooden podium at the center, a low stage with a single microphone, and a modest placard at the side that read, "In memory of those we lost in service of those we love." A few hundred guests gathered, some in suits, some in scrubs, some in faded jeans. The press was there, yes, but tucked off to the side. This wasn't their story to lead. Amira stood inside the glass lobby, with her father dressed in a simple navy blue dress with small white buttons. Catherine stood near them, her voice low, reminding Amira that she didn't have to say anything she didn't want to. But Amira had already decided. They're not here for a show, she said. They're here because they care. Christopher placed a hand on her shoulder. Then speak, like you're talking to one person who needs to hear it, not a crowd. She nodded, holding a folded paper in her hand, not a speech. Just a few thoughts she had written down in her notebook the night before. Thoughts about her mother, about what it meant to matter. Nathaniel opened the ceremony with a brief welcome. He didn't mention stockholders or strategy. He simply said, "This project began with one child's voice. It only makes sense that her voice guides us now." He stepped aside and the spotlight fell on Amira. She walked slowly to the podium. She didn't carry herself like a prodigy or someone coached for the stage. She walked like a 12-year-old who knew the weight of what this place meant. She adjusted the mic and looked out at the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "A few months ago, I was just a kid who liked reading books in corners. My dad worked hard. I tried not to cause trouble. I didn't think I mattered much outside our apartment. But then something happened. Someone heard me speak French. Someone gave me a chance to help. And it changed everything." She looked at the front row where Catherine sat with folded hands, where Nathaniel watched with a kind of still pride, where a nurse wiped a tear from her cheek. "This building used to be a hospital. My mom came here when she was sick. I remember the waiting room, the way the chairs squeaked, the way the windows didn't open. I remember the sound of my dad's breath when he tried to look strong. And I remember the way the nurses smiled, even when they were tired." She paused just for a moment. "Now this place will help other kids. Kids like me. With families like mine, families who don't always get heard the first time, or the second. This center is about listening, really listening, not just to symptoms, to people, to fear, to hope." She unfolded her paper. "I wrote something last night. It's short, but I want to share it." She looked down, then read aloud. "It doesn't matter how small you are, if your heart is big enough, you fit anywhere." The words hung in the air, not grand, but full. Full enough to make the room still. She stepped away from the mic, walked back to her seat. There was no roaring applause, just quiet. Then the kind of clapping that builds not out of obligation, but out of recognition, of truth. Later, as families toured the new wings, Amira walked with her father past the recovery rooms and reading nooks. She asked about the cafeteria menu. He asked if they would have a piano. Catherine gave a brief interview near the mural wall. When asked about Amira's role, she said, "She reminded us that the human part of innovation can't be an afterthought. It has to lead." That's what she did. She led. The rest of the day moved gently. No viral headlines, no clickbait moments. Just children walking hallways that once held only echoes, now lined with bookshelves and light. And Amira back in her corner reading to a small circle of patients, her voice low and clear, as if she was talking to just one person, because really, she always was. It was late evening when the last guests drifted away from the celebration, and the clinic's courtyard fell into a peaceful hush. The ribbons had been cut, the speeches made, and the photos taken, but inside the newly christened Marie James Pediatric Wellness Center, the soul of the day remained. Amira stood alone in the central reading room, a bright but quiet space filled with floor cushions, warm lamps, and shelves of gently worn storybooks that had been donated by volunteers. Her eyes scanned the spines until she found the one her mother used to read Le Petit Prince. She picked it up. carried it carefully to the cushioned bench beneath the window, and opened it as the golden hue of dusk spilled over the pages. She began to read aloud softly in French, her voice tender but certain. The room was empty except for one small boy lying nearby, a child who had just finished a round of treatment and asked if someone could read to him. Amira hadn't hesitated. She read the way her mother once had, pausing for meaning not speed, letting every word land with purpose. In the hallway just outside, Christopher stood leaning against the doorframe. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He watched and listened. Amira's voice slowed near the end of the story. She closed the book gently, looking at the boy who had drifted into sleep, a faint smile on his lips. She reached down, adjusted the blanket over him, and then rested the book on the shelf beside him. She turned toward the door where her father waited silently. He was holding something in his hand, a folded piece of paper worn at the edges, yellowed with time. She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" He hesitated, then stepped forward, handing it to her. "Your mother wrote this before she passed. I found it years ago, tucked behind her dresser mirror. I wasn't ready to give it to you then." Amira unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was delicate looping, familiar, even though she hadn't seen it in so long. "Ma chérie Amira," it began, "if you are reading this, then you have already grown into the kind of girl your father and I always knew you would be. Brave, honest, full of light." Her breath caught. She looked up at Christopher, whose eyes were already red. "I wanted to tell you that love is not something that disappears when a person does. It is something that continues, that heals in places we never expected." Amira's fingers traced the edges of the letter. "There will be times when the world feels impossibly large and impossibly cruel. But I hope you'll remember the music we shared, the stories we read, and the language we loved. Those things are seeds. They bloom in their own time." Christopher whispered, "She wanted you to know she was always with you." Amira nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Live with tenderness, my little star. The letter ended, and you will never lose your way." She folded the letter again and held it close to her chest. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees planted in the front of the center. Each one bore a small plaque engraved with names of children lost too soon and those who had survived. Amira walked to one bearing her mother's name. She knelt beside it and placed the letter beneath the stone marker. "I got your story here, Maman," she whispered, "and now I'll keep reading it forward." The camera would have pulled back there if it had been a film. Not for spectacle, but to show the quiet resilience of a girl who had walked through grief, disbelief, expectation, and hope, and come out still holding on to grace. She didn't need more applause. She didn't need more headlines. What she needed was exactly this: a child who needed a story, a place where love could be heard, and a mother's voice that somehow never stopped speaking. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you've made it this far, you didn't just listen, you felt it. You followed Amira's quiet strength, Christopher's silent resilience, and the transformation that happens when empathy is given space to breathe. Maybe you saw something in their love. Maybe, just maybe, you remembered someone who once gave you a second chance. We don't take your time for granted. These kinds of emotional stories aren't just entertainment, they're reminders that even in a world that often feels cold or loud or unfair, kindness can still echo, forgiveness can still find a voice, and stories, when told with honesty, can help us feel a little more human. We'd love to know, where are you listening from? Which moment stayed with you most? Share it in the comments. This space is not just about storytelling, it's about connection. If this story touched your heart, give it a like. And if you want more heartwarming videos, stories with unexpected twists, deep human truths, and the quiet power of resilience, go ahead and subscribe. It means more than you know, and it helps this channel keep going. With sincere gratitude for your support wherever you are. Whoever you are, thank you. Until the next story, stay kind, stay curious, and take care.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.